Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into some fascinating World War I history?
Absolutely. And today, we're not just talking about battles and dates
Nope, we're getting a much more personal look at the war.
through the eyes of Mary Borden, an American millionaire who became a battlefield nurse.
Really unusual story, right?
Definitely. And we're going to be digging into some amazing sources to learn more about her.
We've got this academic article, A Nurse in the Great War, The Exceptional Voice of Mary Borden. It really gets into the nitty-gritty of her writing and what it reveals about the war experience.
Really insightful stuff.
And then we've got these British Army war diaries to give us that ground-level perspective.
Oh, and don't forget the personal letters and diaries from the Anzac portal.
Right, so that's the Australian and New Zealand side of things.
Exactly. And to round it all out, we'll be pulling in information from the Imperial War Museums and the British Red Cross.
Lots to work with. So what's the mission for today's deep dive?
Well, I think it's to go beyond the typical World War I narrative.
Yeah, to get a sense of what it was really like to be there.
In the trenches, in the hospitals, dealing with the everyday realities of war.
And Mary Borden's story is a perfect window into that world.
Because she wasn't just some passive observer, right?
No, not at all. She actually funded and ran her own mobile surgical hospital on the front lines.
Hospital, chirurgical, mobile, and degrees to be exact.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Haha, right. But here's what's interesting. The article mentions this was the only hospital of its kind. No record of a number 2 or 3.
So she was really operating outside the system.
Absolutely. Which makes you think, could that be connected to another interesting fact?
What's that?
Several nurses from Borden's hospital published their own accounts of the war.
You're thinking maybe working outside the traditional Red Cross structure gave them more freedom?
More freedom to write, to express themselves, to share their experiences. It's a possibility.
So we've got this independent woman running this incredibly successful hospital.
Oh, and did I mention their mortality rate?
Tell me it's good, because this is war we're talking about.
Only 5%. The lowest on the entire Western Front.
Wow, that's amazing.
Soldiers actually nicknamed it Le Petit Paradis des Blessés.
The little paradise of the wounded.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? And they specifically requested to be sent there.
A haven amidst all that chaos. So we've got this independent woman, this incredible hospital.
But what really sets Mary Borden apart is her writing.
Her most famous work is a book called The Forbidden Zone, right?
Yeah, published in 1929, but she wrote it during the war.
And it's not your typical war story, is it?
Not at all. It's a really unique blend of prose and poetry. The article calls it a hybrid, even a collection of fragments.
Fragments. What did she mean by that?
I think she was trying to capture the chaotic, fragmented nature of war itself.
Like traditional storytelling just couldn't contain it.
Exactly. It's also worth mentioning that the book was quite controversial when it came out.
Why is that?
People found it too graphic, especially the descriptions of the operating room.
Oh, I can imagine.
But that discomfort is kind of the point, isn't it?
You mean she wanted to shake people up, make them confront the reality of war?
Precisely. She wasn't interested in sugarcoating anything. Now, the article points out something really interesting about the Forbidden Zone. This idea of a geography of isolation.
Geography of isolation.
Yes, like on the surface, the book is full of spatial language.
Chapter titles like Belgium, the beach, in the operating room.
Right, all very specific locations. But there's also this sense of undefined, shifting boundaries.
Like the war itself warped the world around it.
Exactly. It created this forbidden zone that extended beyond any physical location. Yeah. And Borden's mobile hospital just adds to that sense of instability.
It's like the ground is constantly shifting beneath your feet.
And it's not just limited to those on the front lines either.
Oh, right. We have that letter from the young man in England.
Casually describing a Zeppelin raid over London.
And mentioning heavy casualties like it was just another Tuesday.
Chilling, isn't it? How even seemingly safe places were touched by the war's reach.
Makes you realize that this forbidden zone wasn't just a physical place, it was a psychological state.
A state of being that permeated everything.
So we're starting to get a sense of Borden's unique style.
And the unsettling world she creates in the Forbidden Zone.
But to really understand what life was like during the war,
we need to hear from those who were there.
The soldiers, the nurses, the people who documented their experiences firsthand.
And that's where our other sources come in. The letters, the diaries, give us such a different perspective.
More raw, more immediate.
Exactly. You get these unfiltered accounts of trench life. The mud, the lice, the constant fear.
But also the camaraderie, the unexpected moments of beauty.
And don't forget the diaries from the Anzac portal. Those Australian and New Zealand soldiers had some incredible stories to tell.
It's amazing how, even in the midst of all that chaos, they felt the need to document their experiences.
One soldier even wrote that his diary wasn't meant to be some historical record. He said it was something to look back on later.
Like he needed to preserve those memories, hold on to some sense of normalcy.
And it wasn't just through writing either.
You're thinking about those Kodak Vest pocket cameras.
Exactly. Those tiny cameras were officially banned, but soldiers used them anyway.
To capture what they were seeing, even if it meant breaking the rules.
It speaks to this deep human need to document, to bear witness.
So we've got all these different voices. Borden's poetic fragments, the raw emotion of the letters and diaries, those glimpses into soldiers trying to capture their experiences on camera.
And the article argues that there's something else that connects them all.
What's that?
This idea of transitional spaces. But we'll have to save that for part 2.
Oh.
Welcome back, everyone.
So when we left off, we were talking about this idea of transitional spaces.
And how it connects all the different experiences we're seeing in our sources.
Borden's writing, the soldiers' letters, the diaries, it's like they're all pieces of the same puzzle.
Exactly. The article talks about how Borden often positions herself as an observer, like she's deliberately placing herself between groups, looking out windows on the edges, almost like she's inhabiting these in-between spaces.
Yeah. We talked about how Borden ran that independent hospital, right? And how that seemed to give those nurses more freedom of expression.
Right.
And this idea of transitional spaces makes me think about that on another level.
It's not just physical, right? It's psychological, too.
She's occupying this liminal space.
And that liminal state, it becomes a metaphor for the war's impact on everyone. It's like the war creates this new reality where all the traditional boundaries disappear.
Which takes us back to the title, The Forbidden Zone.
Right.
We talked about it not just being a physical location, but this psychological state.
The war forces everyone into this shared forbidden zone, no matter where they actually are.
Exactly. And Borden doesn't shy away from that. She leans into the darkness of that space.
Oh, absolutely.
Remember that passage from Moonlight, where she describes the war as this all-encompassing force? There is war on the earth, nothing but war. War let loose on the world. War nothing left in the whole world but war. War, world without end. Amen.
Powerful stuff. That repetition, the almost biblical tone, you really get a sense of how overwhelming it felt.
The inescapability of it all, it's like she's giving voice to a whole generation's trauma.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's interesting, even when she's describing this totalizing experience of war, she's still observing it. Remember how she talks about watching from behind the gauze curtains?
Good point.
That tension between detachment and immersion, it's everywhere in her work.
Trying to maintain some distance, even while she's witnessing these horrors.
Almost like a survival mechanism, you know.
Absolutely.
It just makes you wonder how anyone could reconcile those two perspectives, to see all that suffering and loss and not just completely shut down.
And that's where the article's point about the exceptional character of war becoming the norm really clicks. To cope with the unimaginable, to survive, they had to find a new way to process reality.
And when we look at the letters and diaries from the soldiers and nurses, we see the same thing.
Sometimes they're describing things in this really matter-of-fact way, almost clinically.
And then in the next sentence, they're expressing intense grief or longing for home.
Right, like they're all searching for the words for something that's beyond words.
And sometimes those different languages clash. Like in that letter where the soldier's describing the aftermath of the Zeppelin raid, he talks about the crew being roasted like beef.
Such a jarring image.
Casual language used to describe something so horrific.
It really highlights how inadequate language can be when you're trying to capture trauma.
But then that same letter ends with this really tender message to his father. The weather is beastly, but Mrs. and Miss Willie are jolly people, hoping you are all well, love to all, your loving son, Patrick.
It's a reminder that even amidst all that chaos and brutality, life goes on.
There's still kindness and connection and love.
Exactly. Those moments might be fleeting, but they're so important to hold on to.
Speaking of holding on, there's that line from Borden's preface to The Forbidden Zone that really stuck with me. She writes, "Any attempt to reduce these impressions to order would require artifice on my part and would falsify them."
Oh yeah, that's such a crucial point.
She's acknowledging that traditional storytelling just doesn't work here.
You can't impose a neat narrative on the chaos of war.
Right. To really understand this experience, you have to embrace the fragments.
All the messy, disjointed impressions.
But that's a challenge, isn't it? As humans, we crave order. narrative, resolution. We want things to make sense.
Of course.
But maybe that's one of the reasons why Borden's work is so important. It forces us to sit with that discomfort
To embrace the uncertainty and ambiguity.
and accept that there are no easy answers.
War isn't a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end.
It's this ongoing process that keeps shaping people long after the fighting stops.
Right.
And when you think about that in a larger context, it makes you wonder about the forbidden zones that exist in our own lives.
Yeah.
The experiences we struggle to articulate, the emotions that are hard to categorize.
That's such a powerful connection.
It's like she's not just writing about World War I, she's writing about the human condition.
Our struggles with trauma, loss, the search for meaning.
So how do we apply those insights to our own lives? What can we learn from Borden?
Well, maybe it's about having the courage to embrace complexity, to resist the urge to oversimplify or romanticize difficult experiences.
And to value those individual stories, to really listen to the people who have lived through those challenges.
And to seek out those moments of connection, those sparks of hope, even in the darkest forbidden zones.
We started talking about Mary Borden as this outsider, an American millionaire diving headfirst into World War I.
Yeah.
But going through all these sources, it makes you realize the war kind of turned everyone into an outsider.
That's true. The war uprooted everyone, took away everything familiar.
Forced them all into this forbidden zone together, right?
Exactly. And it wasn't just physically being an outsider.
It changed how they talked to each other, how they saw themselves.
It's like their whole world got tilted on its side.
And that's what Borden captures so well in her writing, that feeling of being lost.
Like in the Forbidden Zone, it's not a normal story.
It's more like these flashes, these glimpses of what they went through.
Right, like their minds were trying to piece things together.
Trying to understand something that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and you see that in the soldiers and nurses letters too, right?
Moments of strong emotion, but then they describe things so coldly.
Like they can't even put it into words.
Borden, she found a way to express those feelings, those unspoken things.
And that's why it still hits home for us today.
Because even if we've never seen war, we all have those forbidden zones inside us.
Things we're afraid to look at, things we don't know how to say.
And Borden's work shows us how to approach that.
It's okay to not have the answers. It's okay if it's messy.
It's like she's saying, be uncomfortable, be lost. It's part of being human.
And by going through those feelings, not running from them, you see the world differently.
You connect with people in a different way.
That's what makes all this so powerful. It's not just about the past.
It's about how we live our lives now.
Exactly.
So as we finish up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway? What did we learn from Mary Borden and everyone who lived through this?
I think it's a push to look deeper, to listen to the voices people try to quiet.
To try to understand, even when it's hard.
And remember, even in the worst times, there's still good.
We all have those forbidden zones, but there's also hope, those little bits of light that guide us.
And if you want to keep exploring these ideas, I'd recommend reading The Forbidden Zone by Mary Borden.
Yeah, it's worth checking out.
And the Anzac Portal, the Imperial War Museums, the British Red Cross, they all have incredible firsthand accounts from World War I.
It's amazing how much is out there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.